I never thought the people who brought me into this world would look me in the eye and tell me that my life wasn't worth the cost of a plane ticket. But that is exactly what happened when I was laying in a cold hospital bed thousands of miles away from home, coughing up blood and wondering if I was going to see tomorrow. When the doctor told me I needed an emergency surgery that cost more money than I had ever seen in my life, I called my parents sobbing, begging them to help me, only for my own father to sigh over the phone and say, "Look, we'll come if she dies. But until then, you're an adult and you need to figure out your own financial messes." They hung up on me, leaving me to face what felt like a death sentence all on my own, completely broke and utterly terrified. But just when I thought I was going to be left to rot in that hospital, a complete stranger who had been sitting on the other side of the curtain did something so incredibly shocking and generous that it completely rewrote the course of my life and exposed my family for the monsters they truly are. Was I wrong for cutting my entire family off forever after this? Or would you have done the exact same thing if you found out your parents valued their savings account more than your actual survival? To understand how I ended up alone in a foreign hospital room, we have to go back about 2 years prior, when I made the biggest leap of faith of my life. I grew up in a very rigid traditional household where everything was about appearances, money, and status. My parents, Richard and Alina, were successful in their own right, running a boutique real estate firm that brought in an incredibly comfortable income. Growing up, my older brother, Julian, was always the golden child. He did everything right in their eyes. He went to the business school they chose, joined their firm, and married a woman from another wealthy family. I, on the other hand, was always the black sheep. I loved art, literature, and culture, and my dream was to work in museum curation and historical preservation. My parents constantly reminded me that my passions wouldn't pay the bills, and whenever Julian got a new car or a massive bonus, I was handed a lecture about how I needed to grow up and face reality. Despite their constant disapproval, I worked my butt off, earned a degree in art history, and miraculously landed a prestigious year-long fellowship at a renowned museum in London. It was a dream come true, but it didn't pay very much. It was just enough to cover my tiny, cramped studio apartment, my groceries, and basic living expenses. When I told my parents I was moving across the ocean, they didn't congratulate me. My dad just looked up from his iPad and said, "Don't come crying to us when you realize you can't afford to live in one of the most expensive cities in the world." Julian just laughed and joked that I'd be back in 3 months with my tail between my legs. But I was determined to prove them wrong. For the first 10 months in London, I was doing it. I was working long hours at the museum, taking on freelance writing gigs at night, and living extremely frugally. I didn't go out to fancy dinners, I didn't buy new clothes, and I walked everywhere to save on tube fare. I was exhausted, but I was proud. I was making a life for myself without a single dime of their help. My parents rarely called, and when they did, it was usually my mom asking when I was going to give up this little hobby and move back home to get a real job. Then, out of nowhere, everything came crashing down. It started with what I thought was a simple cold. I had a persistent cough and a mild fever, but I couldn't afford to take a day off work, so I just took some over-the-counter medicine and pushed through it. But over the course of 2 weeks, the cold mutated into something terrifying. I woke up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, gasping for air, and when I coughed into a tissue, it was stained bright red with blood. Panic instantly seized my chest. I tried to stand up, but my legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed onto the floor. I managed to crawl to my phone and call for an ambulance. The next thing I remember is waking up in a frantic, bright hospital emergency room. The doctors were rushing around me, hooking me up to IVs and monitors. After a battery of tests, scans, and x-rays, a severe-looking doctor sat down on the edge of my bed and gave me the grim news. I had developed a severe, aggressive form of pneumonia that had caused an abscess in my lung, and it was rapidly worsening. On top of that, there were complications with my appendix, which was on the verge of rupturing due to a secondary acute infection. I needed immediate, emergency surgical intervention to drain the abscess and remove my appendix, or I would go into septic shock. Because of my visa status and some clerical errors with the temporary insurance policy my fellowship had provided, the hospital administrators informed me that a massive portion of the specialized surgical care and the extended ICU stay wouldn't be covered up front. They needed a massive financial deposit and a guarantee of payment, totaling tens of thousands of dollars, or I would have to be transferred to a public facility that didn't have the immediate availability for the specific thoracic specialist I urgently needed. I was completely trapped, broke, and looking at a medical bill that might as well have been $1 million. Terrified, weeping, and feeling the literal breath leaving my lungs, I called the only people I thought were obligated to love and protect me. I called my parents. My mom answered on the third ring, her voice crisp and impatient. I sobbed into the phone, explaining the diagnosis, the blood, the impending sepsis, and the desperate need for financial help to secure the surgery. I told her I was scared I was going to die alone in this hospital. There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end of the line. Then, I heard her hand the phone to my father. My dad didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't ask what the doctors were doing to keep me stable. His very first words were, "How could you let your insurance lapse? This is exactly what we warned you about. You live carelessly, and now you expect us to just bail you out of a massive financial hole." I pleaded with him, telling him it was an emergency, that I was coughing up blood, and that I would pay him back every single cent if he could just put the money on his credit card so the surgeons could operate. That's when he delivered the blow that shattered my heart into 1,000,000 pieces. He said, "We aren't going to be enabled by your poor planning. If things get truly dire, if the doctors say you aren't going to make it, we'll buy a flight and come if you die. But until then, you're an adult. Figure it out." And then he hung up. I sat there in that hospital bed, the dial tone buzzing in my ear, feeling a level of abandonment that I cannot even put into words. I felt completely worthless. My own flesh and blood had just told me that my life was only worth their time and money if it involved planning a funeral. I covered my face with my hands and began to cry uncontrollably, my shoulders shaking, which only made my chest hurt worse. I felt so completely alone in the world. I was going to die in this room, and nobody cared. But what I didn't realize was that the heavy blue curtain separating my bed from the next bay wasn't soundproof. So that is the horrific situation I was trapped in, looking death in the face while realizing my own parents couldn't care less about me. I had to make peace with the fact that I was completely on my own. Before I tell you the absolutely mind-blowing thing that happened next, I want you to pause right now and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have begged your parents again, or would you have accepted whatever fate had in store for you? As I was sitting there, trying to wipe the tears from my face and hyperventilating, the curtain next to my bed was slowly pulled back. I expected to see a nurse or a doctor coming to tell me I had to vacate the room, but instead, I saw an older gentleman. He looked to be in his late 60s, with kind, crinkling eyes, wearing a sharp tweed jacket despite being hooked up to an IV pole himself. He had a gentle, calm aura about him that instantly made the chaotic hospital room feel a bit quieter. He looked at me with deep empathy and said, "I terribly apologize for eavesdropping, my dear, but these curtains don't do much to hide a broken heart. I couldn't help but hear your phone call." I felt a sudden wave of embarrassment and tried to apologize for making a scene, but he held up a hand to stop me. He introduced himself as Arthur. He told me that he was a retired businessman who had been admitted for some routine cardiac observations, and that he had been sitting there listening to me plead for my life. Arthur looked at me very seriously and said, "No child should ever be told that their life is only worth attending to if they die. Your parents are fools, but you are not going to die today." Before I could even process what he was saying, Arthur called for the attending nurse and asked to speak directly with the hospital's billing and administrative director. Within 15 minutes, a woman from the financial department walked into the room with a clipboard, looking ready to explain the harsh realities of medical debt to me. Arthur stopped her, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a sleek black American Express card. He handed it to the administrator and said, "Put this young lady's entire emergency surgery, her ICU stay, and whatever post-operative care she requires onto this card. Right now. Do not delay her treatment by another second." My jaw dropped. I literally couldn't breathe. I started shaking my head, stammering, telling him that I couldn't accept this, that it was tens of thousands of pounds, and that I had no way of paying him back anytime soon. Arthur just smiled warmly, patted my hand, and said, "You don't owe me a single penny, my dear. I have more wealth than I could ever spend in this lifetime and no family left to pass it on to. Consider this an investment in a future that your parents are too blind to see. Now, let these doctors save your life." I burst into tears again, but this time they were tears of overwhelming gratitude. Within an hour, I was being wheeled into the operating room. The surgeons successfully drained my lung and removed my appendix just in time. The doctor later told me that if I had waited even another 12 hours to secure funding or transfer hospitals, the infection would have spread to my bloodstream, and I likely wouldn't have survived. Arthur literally saved my life. I spent the next week recovering in the hospital. Arthur was discharged a couple of days after my surgery, but before he left, he came to my bedside, gave me his contact information, and told me to focus entirely on healing. He told me that his investment in me wasn't just for the hospital bill. He had also spoken to the museum directors, who happened to be old acquaintances of his, to ensure my fellowship position was held for me until I fully recovered. I couldn't believe the sheer contrast between this total stranger's boundless generosity and my own parents' callous cruelty. While I was recovering, I didn't send a single text to my mother or father. I wanted to see how long it would take for them to check in on whether I was alive or dead. 3 days passed, then 5, then a week. Finally, on the 9th day after my surgery, I received a casual text message from my mom. It read, "Hey, just checking in. Did you get that hospital thing sorted out? Julian's promotion party is this weekend, so we've been busy formatting the catering menus. No, are you okay? No, did you survive?" Just a casual text about a catering menu. The sheer anger that washed over me washed away every ounce of sadness I had left. I realized right then and there that these people were not my family. They were just people I shared DNA with. I didn't reply to her text. Instead, I focused on my physical therapy, got back to my fellowship, and poured my absolute soul into my work. With Arthur's mentorship and backing, I excelled at the museum. He became a fixture in my life, a surrogate grandfather who checked on me, took me out for tea, and actually listened to my ideas. By the end of the year, my fellowship turned into a permanent, high-paying curatorial position at the museum. I was finally financially stable, happy, and building a life I loved, entirely independent of my toxic family. I had blocked their numbers and cut off all contact, choosing to live my life in peace. But the story doesn't end there. About a year later, reality caught up with my parents in the worst way possible. Apparently, Richard and Alina's real estate firm had taken a massive hit due to some incredibly poor investments and fraudulent dealing by my golden child brother, Julian. He had tried to cut corners on a massive commercial development deal. Embezzlement was uncovered, and the entire family business was facing a catastrophic lawsuit that threatened to bankrupt them completely. They were desperate for cash, facing public humiliation, and scrambling to find anyone to help bail them out. One evening, I was sitting in my apartment when my phone rang from an unknown international number. I usually don't answer, but for some reason I picked it up. It was my father. His voice was completely stripped of the arrogance it usually held. He sounded broken, old, and desperate. He started by saying how glad he was that I was doing so well in London, and how he had heard through the grapevine that I had become a prominent curator. Then, without an ounce of shame, he dropped the real reason for his call. He told me about Julian's legal troubles, the impending bankruptcy, and said, "We need you to clear your savings and take out a loan for us. We need about $50,000 immediately to retain a top-tier defense attorney for your brother. Otherwise, everything we've built is gone. We're family, and family helps each other in a crisis." I sat in silence for a moment, listening to him breathe heavily on the other end of the line. The memory of laying in that hospital bed, coughing up blood and feeling my life slip away, flashed vividly behind my eyes. I remembered the exact cold, dismissive tone he had used when he told me they would only come if I died. I let out a soft, dark laugh. My dad sounded confused and asked, "What's so funny?" I cleared my throat and spoke with absolute icy calm. I said, "Dad, look at it this way. I'm not going to be enabled by your poor planning. You and Julian live carelessly, and now you expect me to bail you out of a massive financial hole. I'll tell you what, I'm an adult, and I'm figuring out my own life. If things get truly dire, if the judge hands down a life sentence and the business completely collapses into ashes, I'll buy a plane ticket and I'll come to the funeral of your reputation. But until then, you're adults. Figure it out. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. I could hear my father gasp, completely shocked that I was throwing his exact, cruel words back in his face. Before he could utter a single syllable of defense or rage, I pressed the red button and hung up the phone. I immediately went into my settings and permanently blocked the new number, along with my mother's and Julian's numbers across every single social media platform I owned. They tried to reach out through extended relatives, sending flying miseries to tell me how selfish and heartless I was for abandoning my family in their darkest hour, but I didn't care. They showed me exactly what my life was worth to them, and I simply returned the favor. Today, I am thriving, surrounded by real friends and a chosen family, including Arthur, who showed me what unconditional love and humanity actually look like. This experience taught me that blood doesn't make you family. Love, respect, and showing up when someone is at their lowest is what truly matters. I survived the darkest moment of my life because a stranger chose to be human, while the people who raised me chose to be monsters. Like this video if you were on my side, and think my parents got exactly what they deserved. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, and please share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. I'll see you all in the next story.